Hi, I'm Patrick Vaughn. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. This is a series of conversations between me and a colleague of mine concerning race relations. Today I am joined by
Terrell Carter. I am a pastor as well, and I'm also a professor for Central Seminary in Shawnee, Kansas.
We hope you enjoyed this unscripted conversation. Our hope is that this will help others in our country have conversations, difficult conversations sometimes, about race and racial relations. We begin today with a question that I have for Terrell. We know about the phrase and the movement that's called Black Lives Matter. Can you help me understand what that means? I think I get it, but I'm not sure.
In general, Black Lives Matter means exactly as it sounds, that Black lives are important. The emphasis on this is because of the interactions that have been happening over the past couple of years with police and African American citizens. But it actually goes back further than that. In the big scheme of things, Black Lives Matters means that Black lives are as important as anyone else's life or anyone else's life. That doesn't mean that someone else is not as important as Black people, but historically our country has not respected African American people or valued African American people like they have other races.
So we had slavery, and then we had the Jim Crow
Well,
laws.
in addition to that, we've had multiple other things. I mean, we've had the fact that African Americans, when they have gone to prison, have been experimented on medically. They have been used as test subjects for various things without knowing or without their permission. And then there has been no kind of apology or compensation for those things. So in general, the idea is that Black lives are as important as anyone else's life. And specifically in the context of what has been happening over the last 2 years with police and citizens, it's the idea that Black lives should not be taken haphazardly by police officers.
For those of you who don't know, Terrell is not only a Baptist minister, but he served as a policeman in St. Louis, on the streets of St. Louis for 5 years.
I did, and one of my unfortunate experiences was that there is a tendency to value minority lives, to give less value to minority lives on the scale of. And I don't have any scientific data or any surveys to validate this, but from my experience, my 5 years as a police officer in the city of St. Louis, there's a clear hierarchy of how people are perceived by police officers and how people are treated by police officers. And you can divide that into racial or color or ethnicity, but you can also do it economically as well. So there's a way that people are treated based on which racial category they line up in, and then secondarily what social or economic category they are lined up in.
Well, what do you say to those then who want to respond and say blue lives matter? Pointing to police, or what about brown lives or yellow lives, white lives?
All lives do matter, but in the Black Lives Matter movement, and in my mind, when someone says that, it's trying to take attention away from what the original discussion was about in the first place. Again, when you say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that someone else's lives doesn't matter, but what it means is that Black lives have not mattered as much, and it's an opportunity to bring attention to that. So when someone disqualifies the statement Black, or attempts to disqualify the Black Lives Matter statement, they are, well, from what I understand, trying to discount the argument or the underlying things that are trying to be addressed.
And I'm guessing, assuming here, that movements like this, phrases, slogans like this are important because if a race has historically been oppressed, put down, pushed down, disregarded, that something special needs to be said, something needs to stand out to bring attention to the issue.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense, and people try to focus on Black Lives Matter, and then they try to say, well, Black Lives Matter are the people that have been causing so much destruction. No, those are just some, as my grandfather would say, some outside knuckleheads who have come in and done things. I, I personally know the man who owns the Black Lives Matter name or slogan. He's in St. Louis, Missouri, and this idea is something that is to help people. Now, obviously, you're going to have, again, as my grandfather would say, you're going to have knuckleheads involved in anything that occurs. But just as police officers say, well, these are bad guys. These are a few rotten apples on this side. They don't represent all of us. Well, then the same thing needs to be said for the African American community or the Black Lives Matter community. Just because you have a few who are doing wrong things, that should not be an indication or an implication against everyone in the entire movement. And I say this having never participated in a Black Lives Matter movement. I don't have any Black Lives paraphernalia or anything like that. But I do recognize the value that the phrase, that the movement, and that the idea has in trying to bring conversation or bring greater clarification to certain things.
Terrell, that's very helpful. Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up soon, but I do want to touch on another subject today. Usually, in my mind, and I think this is true pretty much across the board, when we in our country discuss racism, it's a white-black issue. And yet we are a country with many different races, people from South America, Africa, Asia. Why does it come down to black and white? What about other races too?
Well, in general, the other races that have been, let's speak very truthfully. The white culture has been the dominant culture and became the dominant culture through violence, through underhanded methods, things like that. They came in and they killed Native Americans. They brought Chinese, Japanese to the country, or when Chinese and Japanese came to the country, they, put them to slave labor as well on building certain parts of our country's infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Jews, any other kind of minority of one of the major minority groups. Whenever the United States has been called out for their actions towards that group, the United States has tried to do something to compensate or to make up for what has been done to that minority group, whether it's setting land.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. I wasn't quite following.
Whether it's setting land aside for Native Americans or setting up universities and things like that for Native Americans, whether it's giving reparations to Chinese or Japanese families, any of those kind of things, the United States has, in general, done something to compensate or to acknowledge that they have treated that particular racial group wrong. But when it has come to African Americans, the United States has not done anything like that. So in general, in the African American community, the reason why it comes down to black and white is because there are many people who feel like the United States has not done its part to try to heal the divide or bridge the divide that has occurred between the two races. And then when there have been conversations about bridging the divide, there's always pushback as if African Americans don't have anything to complain about.
Okay. That reminds me, I was speaking with a friend a couple of weeks ago. He's a retired businessman, very, very successful. And he said 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they were grappling with this issue about hiring minorities. And he said that they worked as hard as they could to employ minorities. And they found it to be very, very difficult. And I can't recall his exact question, but it was like, how do we make sense of that? We tried something, we tried that. But that's a little bit different from what you're talking about, where there's an acknowledgement that an entire people have been oppressed, hurt, degraded.
So I'll use an example from both of us are pastors and both of us operate in the world of faith. In the 20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention, actually before the 20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention was given the opportunity, or they faced an opportunity to either stand up against slavery or to go along with it. And they decided to go along with it, which caused multiple separations from groups and people from the Southern Baptist Convention. Years later, within the last 10 years, the Southern Baptist Convention finally apologized for that. The members of the Southern Baptist Convention at that time were not apologizing for their own sins or for their own beliefs or support of slavery, because none of them did. But what they believed is that it was necessary for them to acknowledge that that happened and to acknowledge the impact that it had on their relationships with African Americans. Just in the last 2 weeks, the president of the International Chief of Police Association apologized to minority communities, and he acknowledged in his apology, or his statement, excuse me, that law enforcement has many times served as the face of discrimination in the United States, that based on laws, based on all these other things, they were put in the position of, and I could even say me because I'm a former law enforcement officer, but law enforcement was put in the position of doing things that in hindsight, they realized, or this organization realized, was not in the best interest of all humanity. I guess my overall point is that many African Americans, many minorities are looking still for something like that from the United States. And the point is, your original question was, why does it always break down to black and white? Well, because the two predominant, for multiple years, African Americans and whites or Caucasians have been the two predominant cultures in the United States, or the two largest cultures, but now African Americans are third. But the point is that there's so much history between the two groups of people, and so much history that has not been healed, has not been adequately addressed. And so for the most part, I think that's why it boils down to black and white on such a regular, consistent basis.
That's helpful. Thank you. I've read and was talking with another colleague about the history of race relations in our country, and he explained that law enforcement agencies, like maybe the sheriff's department or the police department, actually began, they were developed during the time of slavery to make sure slaves stayed where they were, or if they escaped, to go out and get them and bring them back. Is that
actually?
I
just got through writing a column last week for the Huffington Post where I talk about that exactly. So, again, I'm a former St. Louis City police officer. The St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department was started to protect white families against Indians in the Midwest as the town began to expand. The police departments in the South started, as you just said, as efforts to capture escaped slaves and to either return them to their masters or to imprison them and then to rent them out to corporations, to companies at the time. So why do Black Lives Matter? Because we have not been treated like we have mattered throughout the history of the United States. We've been treated as property, as a means to an end. And it's, people want that to change.
So that leaves me with one final question. As a white male, as someone who has benefited from the system, the privileges I have had, not even aware of them most of the time, but I've benefited from them. What can I do to help heal racial relations? I mean, do I need to personally apologize for slavery in our country, or continue to focus on my own struggles with racism, or what? I mean, should I say I'm sorry, write an article, or what can I do as an individual?
I think that, number one, no, I don't think you don't need to apologize for someone else's deeds or someone else's actions. I think that you are doing helpful things now by engaging in conversation, and that's the simplest thing, is to engage in conversation and to listen. One of the other simple things is just to try to understand someone else's perspective, to understand someone else's position. And then when you see, I'm going to use a word very specifically, when you see injustice, when you see racial discrimination, when you see any of those things, speak up and help to make sure that those things don't occur on a regular basis. In my mind, it's not about reparations. I personally don't want reparations. I don't want somebody to come to me and apologize. What I want is for somebody to treat me equally and to treat me like a man.
With respect.
When there's an opportunity give me the opportunity to participate. And if I am capable and able, then recognize that and celebrate that with me. And if I am not, then I have to deal with that. The difference is, I'm going to give an example, and I'm going to try to keep it short for my personal life. So I interviewed for a position at a major university in St. Louis a couple of years ago. When I walked through the door, there were only 2 black people in the building, and they both were receptionists at the front desk. When I get into the actual interview, there's a 3-phase interview. I interview with some administrators, I interview with faculty members, and then I interview with community members. And I did not get offered the position. Okay. But I made sure to call the main administrator back when I found out I didn't get the position to say, would you mind advising me or helping me or coaching me so I can understand why I didn't get the position? Mm-hmm. And he, instead of talking to me on the phone, asked me to come in to meet him face to face. I said, okay, I'll come in and meet you face to face. And I did. And he was nervous, and he literally was sweating the entire time that he was talking to me. And he said, well, the reason you did not get picked up for this position is because you didn't ask enough questions. I said, I didn't ask enough questions. He said, yeah, one of the comments from the committee was you did not ask enough questions. And I said, you know, if I would have asked a ton of questions, then I would have been the angry black guy who didn't appreciate the opportunity that he was receiving. But he said, well, the rest of the committee's response was, you were wonderful, you were qualified, you were outstanding, but you just weren't good for this position. They were willing to consider you for another lower level entry position. And I was like, wow, my resume is too long, not just long enough. My resume is too long. And essentially what he told me in the end was, you just did not fit the culture of this particular blah, blah, blah. And the culture was all white and 90% male. So I've gone through multiple interviews like that. The point of me bringing that up is recognizing that that I am a man, that I am qualified, and give me the respect that you would give someone else on a personal level. And so as you interact with other people, as you spend time with other people, to do those kind of things, anyone, instead of thinking that you have this person figured out, whether they are black or whether they are white, because this goes both ways. This is not just a white problem. This is not just for white people to try to fix. Mm-hmm. This is, how do we all get along better? How do we all respect one another? How do we all figure out how to live in a world together and to do the things that we're supposed to do? So again, it's how do we recognize people as individuals? How do we learn about them and the things that are important to them, and to not put them into a box and think that we know them just because of what they look like?
Mm-hmm. I think one of our biggest challenges is to be able to see, recognize, and then affirm the dignity of all people, regardless of what they look like.
I agree. I agree completely.
That's a very tough challenge.
But the challenge is that doesn't always happen both ways, though. We sometimes, some of us experience the lack of dignity, the lack of whatever on a regular basis.
I was going to wrap up, but I've got to bring this in now. And if you're watching and you're bored, okay, you might want to turn it off. But I was on the way to church to a staff meeting this morning, and I went through what has only to be described as a speed trap. There were 4 or 5 policemen on the side of the road, and they were just waiting, cars, to come and stop, because evidently that is a place where people really speed. And I pulled over, and the officer walked over to my car, and he said, "You know why we asked you to stop?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "You were doing 57 and a 35. I said, I didn't realize that. So he went back to his police car. He wrote me up a ticket. He brought it back. He was smiling. I shook his hand. I even got out of the car, and I said, "My staff at the church will not believe that I got stopped for speeding, and that's why I'm late today. Can I take a selfie with you?" And he said, "Sure." So I've got a selfie of the policeman, the state trooper who gave me a $97 ticket today. That was actually an unusual exchange, but it was warm and it was respectful. But I remembered what an African American colleague told me just 3 weeks ago, that he is already teaching his 4-year-old son that when he is stopped by a policeman, to look straight, put his hands on the steering wheel, do not reach for anything, don't say a word until the policeman comes up. And I've said this before in our conversation, and I'll say it again. That's two different worlds. It's just two different worlds. We can't fix that, but I hope others will find this conversation helpful.
The day you see me taking a selfie with a state trooper or a police officer will be a very unique day, to say the least.
I think that's called the second coming. Jesus is going to come back. Yeah, nice way to put it.
Okay, I can wait. I can wait a little while for the second coming.
I think you've waited a long time, but we'll each continue to do our part. Terrell, thank you so much for your conversation today and your openness and your candor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This has been Scratching the Surface. I am Patrick Vaughn, and I have been joined today by
Terrell Carter.
Thank you.